Hi, I'm your host Dave Kemp, and this is Future Ear Radio. Each episode, we're breaking down one new thing, one cool new finding that's happening in the world of hearables, the world of voice technology. How are these worlds starting to intersect? How are these worlds starting to collide? What cool things are going to come from this intersection of technology? Without further ado, let's get on with the show. All right, so we're joined here today by Mark Truong. Mark, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Hey Dave, thanks so much for getting me on the show today. So my name is Mark Truong, as you just said. I'm a student audiologist currently in first year audiology here in Melbourne. So I also run a hearing healthcare podcast called the Hear Me Out podcast. I'm focused around interviewing leaders and business owners in the hearing healthcare space to get a better understanding of every single part of the hearing healthcare space, because one of the core motivations was I was looking online and trying to find more information about the hearing healthcare space, the audiology space, and all I was coming up with was journal articles, more journal articles, and all of that. I was really trying to find some digestible content so that I'm able to get a better understanding of not only the research department of the field of audiology, but also the corporate life, the business life, and even the outreach and philanthropy side of that.
That's excellent. And so, I wanted to bring Mark on for a couple of reasons today. First of all, I'm impressed by him. He's 21 years old, and he's, I guess it's a sign of the times that just the younger generations are just more savvy. But, I think it's so cool that, he's a first-year student living in Melbourne, Australia, and he's launched a podcast. He's interviewing a lot of respective people within the hearing healthcare space. A lot of the names, when I looked at his podcast, I was like, oh my, you've interviewed him and you've interviewed her. So really, really cool from that standpoint. And, for me, as somebody that's been sort of like, to your point, you're looking up all this information and you're just kind of seeing like journals and articles. And so, I had sort of the same realization of, newer forms of content don't exist in wide amounts quite yet within the hearing healthcare space. And so for me, I'm always on the lookout for fellow creators, fellow content creators. And so I found Mark. I thought his podcast was awesome. Wanted to bring him on and talk about the podcast and talk about some of his takeaways, from interviewing a lot of these different different people from different backgrounds within the hearing healthcare space. So before we dive into, like your podcast in general, why don't you share with us sort of the motivation of how you even decided to get started with this podcast and go down this route?
Yeah, absolutely. Just as I said before as well, there wasn't much information out there at all. And I just wanted to get the inside look about what actually happens behind the scenes of the hearing healthcare industry and the audiology industry, behind why people do what they do, a bit of this story, and what really happens in order for this whole machine, which we call the audiology industry, to actually happen. So I've been interviewing a lot of people from everywhere, from the research department to the manufacturers, the business owners, to even the hearable space, which is definitely something which you yourself look at a lot, and I think your audiences are very familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the motivations was I just couldn't find anything out there, and I thought it was a great opportunity to start to network and start to build my connections and my network, and truly just speak with the leaders and truly get their thoughts on what's actually happening in the industry, what's coming in the next few years, and what they're really excited for.
Yeah.
And being able to speak with them has really like ramped up my fire and kind of really made me interested in what I'm doing, because before I was just going through the course and just studying and studying and studying, and there wasn't really much motivation, and there was really not much interest in what I was doing.
Yeah, I think it's cool that, like I mentioned earlier, you're a young guy. And I think that a lot of these professionals that you've worked with and that you've recorded episodes with, they're really responsive to the idea that, giving back and sharing their wisdom. And I applaud you for taking it upon yourself to, create this medium to facilitate that, because I think that's where the rubber is currently meeting the road, is that a lot of people are looking at this and they're like, I would love to do a podcast, but there is not a podcast that really exists in this space, or I don't know how to start a podcast on my own. So I feel as if there's a major opportunity here to have these kind of conversations that you've been having. So the motivation all makes sense. And I think that for any young,
Yeah,
potentially student audiologists or aspiring hearing healthcare professionals in any capacity, look to somebody like Mark and see what he's doing, and you can realize that there's no arbitrary limitation here. Like, anybody can do this.
absolutely.
Um, so Mark,
Yeah, and
why
I
don't you go ahead? Go ahead.
yeah, and I wouldn't even discourage anyone. Like, I don't even think of you like if you do start a podcast, which I extremely encourage. I think it's amazing to build that network of podcasters in the space, and it isn't competition. It's not we're not fighting against each other,
No,
because
not at all.
the seas is so blue, and there's so much fish in the ocean, and there's so many people to interview, and there's so many different avenues to cover. Like, I myself focus around a lot of the business leaders and a lot of the corporate leaders, and there's a lot of people who are saying, hey, go into speaking with the clients and go into speaking with the clinicians. But I've been trying to do that, and it's not really my interest. And yeah, even if somebody's interested in maybe the clients or the clinicians, that would be an amazing new podcast to start up and get more information about that.
Yeah, I know. I think, you touched on something there that's interesting. It's counterintuitive. You initially, I think, when you start creating content, you sort of you shelter. I know, at least, like, this is how I was when I first started blogging. Was I was always worried, like, am I giving away like all my good stuff? And what I came to realize was that there was absolutely no point in doing that, because
Yeah,
there's sort of, you can always remix things, and there's new ways. And but more importantly, when you put stuff out into sort of the ether, people take it, and then they take it, and they apply their own thoughts
spin to
and,
it.
and insight, and in it grows in ways that you never anticipated, and it grows in a whole lot more meaningful ways. And I've always found that by collaborating with other content creators, the best stuff tends to come about, because you're really insightful about a number of different things, and I'm insightful about a number of different things. And when there's overlap, that's when the best type of stuff happens. And to your point,
Yeah,
this idea where just because there's, call it a, if you're considered in just a audiology podcast, you don't need to look at it through that lens of like, oh, well, that's taken and I can't, therefore there's no opportunity for me anymore. Just as you laid out,
yeah,
there's so many different facets of what, each segment is. I mean, I'm really tied into like the voice technology space, and there are probably 50 different podcasts, but they're all a little bit different in their approach. And so,
absolutely. Yeah.
there's so many different avenues that you can take with all this. So I am totally in agreement with you. I don't discourage anybody that's listening to sway them away from, in any capacity, creating content that they feel that, that they're passionate about making.
Yeah, another one of the motivations is hearing healthcare awareness is absolutely atrocious.
Yeah.
And just creating an avenue to, well, my initial motivation was to get it out to the public, and um, to get the public to kind of get a better understanding of how it works un, under the covers. Yeah. And but as I've been doing it a lot more, I think my audience at the moment is more audiologists, and getting the information out to the
Hmm.
to the professionals, and um, giving them a better understanding of everything along the chain. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. So, let's talk a little bit about the podcast, right? Like, so you've done
Yeah.
10 episodes so far. Looks like they range anywhere from 30 minutes to 70 minutes. So you've had some medium length conversations, you've had some longer conversations. Rather than go into too much detail with any one of the episodes, although I do encourage everybody that's listening, if you're at all interested in the hearing healthcare space, you should give it a look. The Hear Me Out
Thank you.
podcast. But share with us, some of the like the macro takeaways that you've had from some of the conversations that you've had.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the common threads amongst um, everyone I've been speaking with is that if you focus on the customer or the client or the patient, depending on who you are, and depending on which area of the industry you're in, um, if you focus on them and your end consumer, you will succeed.
Hmm.
And that if you're tailoring your research towards your end consumer, if you're tailoring your products towards your end consumer, if you're constantly tweaking and upgrading and updating your software for your end consumer, um, you'll ultimately succeed. So that's one of the major takeaways I've really been able to hone in on as I've been interviewing more and more people.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I know. Just going off of that one, I mean, we hear a lot about like this idea of now we're moving more toward this like patient-driven model, right? And this idea
patient-centered care.
yeah,
Yeah,
patient-centered care. And, obviously that's very representative of like just everything today. It's not just calling patients or customers or whatever. The consumer is so much more informed because of the internet and because of the way in which we've progressively gotten better at using the internet and because of just how easy it is to access reviews and whoever we've determined to be authority figures. If it's our friends, maybe it's through Facebook. You see your friend posted their experience of getting fit with a hearing aid at Costco, and maybe they're saying that it was a great experience, maybe they're saying it was a really poor experience, but it needs to be noted that many people today, they are getting informed through social sites, through Yelp, through Google reviews.
yeah,
These are the things that they're doing first to even to even start. They're not even going to click on your website unless they feel as if this is a legitimate place. And to your
yeah,
point that you made earlier, unfortunately, I mean, there isn't a whole lot of broad awareness in the general population around, hearing healthcare and that professional and the type of value that they provide. And so I think that like across this next decade, with all of these new self-fit technologies and over-the-counter options that are going to become available, this is going to be where, I think we're going to have to really put our money where our mouth is as an industry, and
yep,
the professionals are going to have to they're going to have to really adapt here. And I the good thing is, and I had this conversation with Jeff Cooling on previous episode with this podcast, is um,
yeah. Please watch the episode. It was really amazing.
yeah, that was a good episode. And one of the things though is it would be way worse to be on the other side of the equation. And what I mean by that is if you are, if you didn't have this experience, if you didn't have this education of really being the pedigree example of what could be a best practice, or a best experience, 5-star, gold star, amazing experience, which is largely predicated on your experience as a service provider and being just gold star in every facet of that service.
Yep.
Again, I would way rather be in that position than be in the commoditized position where you're not really providing any value other than maybe your distribution channels, like
Yeah.
easier. So people say, well, I can go and I can buy this at Walgreens or I can buy it online. And you know what? That's great. But when there ever comes a point where that consumer feels as if they want a solid experience, that whole model falls apart because it's not service oriented. And so I think that
Yes.
the challenges for the service oriented model is going to have to be all around how do you communicate and position your value as a provider in the general population's eyes? How do you make it widely known that this avenue of accessibility exists, that you can access these types of devices through a much more service-oriented channel?
Absolutely. I think one of the other takeaways I've had is that although patient-centered care is a buzzword at the moment, and
Mhm,
everyone's chucking out there trying to bump up their practice, bump up their organization, bump up their hearing aid company, or whatever not. Um, the thing is, if all we're doing is dispensing hearing aids, the OTCs, the online shops, and everything else is going to take over.
mhm,
All we're doing is doing a hearing test and fitting a hearing aid. Technology will destroy that.
mhm,
And if we're not actually providing the care, we're not providing the human interaction and the service behind that, why are we there?
mhm. And I think that going off of that, like again, going off the conversation that I had with cooling, you know, sometimes that sounds vague. Sometimes that's like, okay, so what exactly is this service model? But you have to think of it as if you have a hearing loss, there's no cure for that. There's no remedy for your actual hearing loss.
Yes.
There's ways to preserve your hearing loss, and there's ways to preserve your hearing, and there's ways to make sure that you mitigate it. And that's what that service aspect is it's a very consultative, relationship based approach that that your audiologist or whatever type of hearing healthcare professional, this is the person that is responsible for helping to guide you as the patient through that rehabilitation process, so that you know that you're doing everything that you possibly can to preserve your hearing. You're abiding by a lot of the different best practices. And again, I think that this is going to evolve, this aspect, this type of
Yep.
service oriented, relationship based consultative approach is going to evolve to include how do you get the most out of your technology. I think that's a really
Absolutely.
big aspect of this, is as these devices become more and more sophisticated, as they're capable of more things, I think that there is a tremendous opportunity for the provider to take on that provision of knowledgeable assistance approach, where
Yeah.
it's not necessarily just here's the best ways in order to preserve your hearing, but it's also here are ways in which you might find value in using the voice assistant that resides in your hearing aid. If you're getting older and you're at risk for certain comorbidities that might be linked to hearing loss, um,
Yep.
things that might be related to hypertension, or anything that relates to like blood pressure, or just some of the different
Yep.
vital
Fall
signs.
risks or this or that.
Exactly.
Yes.
Those types of things, we could be monitoring those through the devices. So I think that there again is this opportunity that's burgeoning, that's going to become more and more front and center, is being just an absolute expert on everything that pertains to this experience. That's, I think, the key to how you differentiate. And so I think that it's going to be on the providers to constantly be re-educating themselves. They already know everything that pertains to the world of how do you rehab your, or at least they should, and they should be abiding by the best practices. But I think it's also on them to be educating themselves on, like, what does this new world of technology look like? Because it is changing rapidly, but that's a huge opportunity, in my opinion, for the providers to really differentiate themselves.
Yeah, because you've been saying, I heard your conversation with Jeff, and he was saying that instead of being a dispenser who provides a service, you should be a service provider who dispenses hearing aids. And
Exactly.
as I've been speaking with more businesses and more owners of audiology clinics and online retailers, um, I've been trying to push because I'm trying to start a consultation business as well to help audiology clinics to get their social reach out, start
Mhm.
creating educational content online and stuff like that. I think it's really important, like you were saying before, to get that information to the customer before you even start selling the hearing aid. And I think there's a huge space to do something like what sorry, I can't remember who's who's the YouTuber audiologist.
Oh, Cliff Olson.
Yeah, Cliff Olson. Sorry.
Yeah, no
Yeah,
problem.
what Cliff Olson's doing to educate the patient about everything from hearing healthcare,
Hmm.
um, like how to prevent hearing loss, educate them about different types of hearing aids and why they need it. And I think there's a huge space for even individual clinics to do that and to attract customers and more people to come in before they've even suggested a hearing aid,
Hmm.
trying to educate them on how to, yeah, all of that.
Yeah, no, you make a good point there. I think you're right. There's a tremendous opportunity for education in a number of capacities, and I think that again, it's this idea of you have this asset, and that asset is your experience. Your asset is really truly understanding the science behind all this, as a professional and as a provider. And the challenge is in a world that predates what we're about to really start to experience, is that you were the only channel that people were really limited to. Like if you
Yeah,
wanted to get a some type of amplification device, barring the types of PSAPs that have been available for a long time, but if you wanted to get that type of device, you had to go through you. So you were a gatekeeper of sorts. And when that barrier of entry gets removed, it's going to create a void, basically a void where it's a expertise gap where
yep,
if you are doing nothing more, just like you said at the beginning, where if you're doing nothing more than providing a hearing test, fitting somebody with a hearing aid and seeing them on their way, that previously had been the status quo potentially. I obviously know there's a number of providers out there that are doing way, way more than that. So I'm
absolutely,
not
absolutely.
trying to disparage the profession in any capacity, but I'm speaking to this idea of, that the business model is getting disrupted from that standpoint, where the consumer has more options available to them now. And I
Yep,
think that as a byproduct of that, gatekeeper status, they, there has been, it's been perceived as you are a hearing aid dispenser, and that, for better or worse, that might be the perception that is out in the market. And so now that these devices are going to be more widely available, I think that there's just a massive need for a total rebranding and repositioning of the role of the professional. And
yep.
again, I think what that role all comes down to is this provision of knowledgeable assistance that transcends everything that had been done traditionally, to start to incorporate the new facets of these Bluetooth connected devices and what it means to be a in the ear computer in just about every sense of the word. And so I think that that's where a lot of the potential is going to come from here, is going to be those professionals that find a way to really communicate to their local markets that this is why you should come see me, rather than go to a big box retailer or a drug chain or even order it online. And there's a very distinct differentiated experience by going through me.
I think there's a lot of things we can learn as the audiology industry from the phone industry.
Hmm.
There's a huge community of reviewers like MKBHD or Unbox Therapy, where
Hmm.
they're constantly every week they're reviewing new tech and reviewing new phones and kind of taking that Apple Genius approach. As I
Yep.
was watching your episode yesterday, I think there's a real need to differentiate yourself. Like people can buy iPhones online anywhere, anytime, but people still go into the stores because there's the community, there's the environment, there's all the phones on display,
Hmm.
and there's Apple Genius there. And trying to like reposition yourself as a hearing aid genius or as a hearing healthcare genius is kind of a new way where you need to differentiate yourself, because if you can buy it online, you need to be providing extra service or extra information in order for them to come in.
Totally. And like, I mean, just a quick example of this, something that I've been talking about lately is the idea of being a podcast expert, right? Like this is a secondary use case of many Bluetooth hearing aids today. You talk to young Bluetooth hearing aid wearers, and they are like ravenous podcast listeners. A lot of the ones that I've talked to, they will listen to 5-6 hours a day. And so I think that, again, because the demographics tend to slant toward the older generation, they might not be exposed to this yet. But if you can, during that fitting process, again, I'm not saying to like dedicate a giant portion of this, but maybe even like 3 to 5 minutes where you maybe have some literature. You, as the provider, you've done your homework. You've
Yeah.
I outlined, okay, here are my favorite 3 podcasts for history, and you go through, hockey and baseball,
Yeah, or
and
even
go through go
even
through
if
10
it's
different categories.
audiobooks or
Literally, exactly.
yeah, anything. Yeah.
And so you have uh, just a handful of recommendations, and you give them a step 2 guide of how to do this. And again, what that does is it differentiates your experience. Then the person says, oh, I was introduced to this amazing thing that I love about my hearing aids, this podcasting thing that I can now do. Again, it sounds really simple, and it sounds like, well, anybody can do that. Anybody can think of that. But again, these aren't the types of things that are going to be done inside of a Costco or inside of a Walgreens. They're going to just get you on your way. So if you can have those personal touches so that you can give somebody this, brand new type of content that they're maybe going to love, what are they going to do? They're going to go and they're going to tell their friends, I had this amazing experience, and that's that word of mouth
Yeah.
marketing. Like, that's one way that I think this can grow. And that's a really tiny example of how this thing is evolving, and new aspects to these devices that you can speak to, throughout that fitting process.
Wow, and even creating like email lists and blogs around that
Totally.
so that your customer doesn't only think that you're a one-dimension person who doesn't love anything outside of audiology, and that
Totally.
they get to experience everything outside of that as well. It's really interesting. Um, yeah, well, another really big takeaway I've been having as I've been having these conversations is um, a high level of curiosity really in the long term leads to success, like perpetual success.
Hmm.
Like I've been interviewing people who's been in this industry for 20, 30 years, and a lot of them I've been seeing have had maybe 9 to 10 different jobs or like 5 to 6 different jobs, and they've been going um, from different hearing aid companies to different hearing aid companies or from clinic to clinic. And I think one thing I've really seen in everyone I've been interviewing is that they really have a real passion for what they do,
Hmm.
and they also have a real curiosity for what they do. So even if a new technology comes out or a new avenue of doing something comes out or a new diagnostic method comes out, if they're constantly interested in that, like my conversation with Deanne Rudden, I know
Hmm.
you spoke with her on Oak Tree TV, and my conversation with Yul Bailin, who's currently doing consulting um, at a corporate level. Um, yeah, it's something which has been really concurrent in everybody I've been speaking with is that if you have a high level of curiosity and you're not kind of like shunning it, and you're not like, oh, that's a new technology, the phone
Hmm.
is going to go out of date, nobody's going to use it, it's just a fad. um, if you're able to kind of keep on top of that, your business will always succeed, and your skills will always be needed.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's like a lot of different ways that you can even interpret that too. So maybe it's not even that you love the technology itself, but what you love is the reaction that your patient has when you introduce them to something new that their hearing aids can do. And so therefore, you know, it's not necessarily that you love building this list of podcasts that you're going to recommend to them. You love that end result. You love that satisfaction that you get when you see that patient, really light up and smile. And I think that, like, to your point, I think this can take it can take shape in many different forms. Like, you can imagine that you can be passionate, not necessarily about one aspect or another, but in totality you're really passionate about what you do. And I think that bleeds into a lot of the different day-to-day type stuff.
Yeah, and I think one thing, if there's an audiologist listening to a podcast, is that building that reputation and building that brand and building customer experience ultimately leads to better business outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's a lot of people who are worried that that 2 to 3 minutes or 5 minutes or 10 minutes extra time that they're spending is going to eat into their profits, and it's going to eat into their margins. But ultimately, if you're providing that ultimate experience,
Yep.
in the long run, it's going to lead to better long-term experiences and long-term outcomes.
Totally agree, Mark. Totally agree. Well, this has been great. I really appreciate you coming on, Mark. Thanks to everybody who tuned in and listened through the end of the episode, and we'll chat with you next time. Cheers.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for tuning in today. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Future Ear Radio. For more content like this, just head over to futureear.co, where you can read all the articles that I've been writing these past few years on the worlds of voice technology and hearables and how the two are beginning to intersect. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll chat with you next time.